Good morning. Is it working? Oh, yes, it is. So all the clocks, including mine, all say different times. But mine now says 9 o'clock on the dot. And to honor and respect everyone who is here on time, we'll just get started. So my name is Michelle Strobe. I am the director of the Stegner Center's Environmental Dispute Resolution Program. And I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the University of Utah, S.J. Quinney College of Law, and the Wallace Stegner Center. I'm going to start out with thank yous. That's how we always start with this, and I have a lot of thank yous, actually. So the first is a very special thank you, actually, to Jim Moore, who is a senior fellow with the Stegner Center. He's former general counsel for Huntsman Chemical Corporation, and it's his leadership in planning this seminar, actually, and coming up with the idea for the seminar that gets us all here today. So many thanks to Jim for getting us started on this. I also want to thank the planning committee members. We had a planning committee that sort of crossed stakeholder interests, to use the lingo of my work. And I've identified them alphabetically, but they're all equally important, right? So Melissa Barbanel with Barrick Mining, Denise Dragoo with Snell and Wilmer, Rob Dubuque with Western Resource Advocates, who will be joining us later today. Don't shake his hand, he's sick. Jim Holtkamp from Holland and Hart, who is not able to join us at all today because he was called away very quickly to Central America to train the environment ministry lawyers in El Salvador. And he took that gig rather than coming to join us. But it's good. He helped us put this entire seminar together. And Bob Kiter from the Stegner Center was on the planning committee, and Laura Lockhart with the Utah Attorney General's office, and then Jim Moore and myself. Also want to give a big thank you to Amanda Smith and DEQ for giving us this venue to use. It's really very wonderful. And finally, a thank you to the Stegner Center Associate Director Jan Nystrom, who I think may also be homesick. A lot of sickness going around, and Events Coordinator Erin Reardon, who's right here in the back, for all their help in the logistics and taking care of us to make sure we have a comfortable and a valuable day today. So many thanks to them as well. So if you have been to a Stegner Center event before, you know there's always announcements about what's coming next, what the Stegner Center is doing next. So I'll take care of that now. And I'm going to announce 3 future programs, and there's some information in the back about them as well. The 20th Annual Stegner Center Symposium is going to focus on air quality, health, energy, and economics, and it's going to be held March 5th and 6th in 2015. On December 2nd of this year, Jim Steenberg, who is professor of atmospheric sciences at the U, is going to give a presentation during the noon hour at the College of Law on his new book entitled Secrets of the Greatest Snow on Earth, Weather, Climate Change, and Finding Deep Powder in Utah's Wasatch Mountains and Around the World. And then the third thing that's coming up that I'll tell you about is on December 4th, Stegner Center is going to be joined by independent filmmaker Toby McLeod, not sure how to pronounce the last name, and Utah author Terry Tempest Williams. And it's going to be an evening presentation at the main library downtown, and it's going to include screenings of films from the series Standing on Sacred Ground. Should actually be really good. Several people have sent me emails saying, oh, I saw them in San Francisco or whatever. The movie's apparently terrific. So that's on December 4th. So with all of that, thank you and announcements, let's get started. And I'd like to before I give the time over, just to let you know, you have in your agenda detailed biographies of all of the panel, all of the speakers and the keynote speaker. But in the interest of time, we're going to only introduce panelists by their title and affiliation. But now I'd like to give time to Jim Moore so that he actually could introduce in more detail our keynote speaker.
There you are. Carol, you want to come up? I was hoping you hadn't left. Oh, good. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Carol Dinkins, who is our keynote speaker today. Carol is a partner at Vincent & Elkins in both their Seattle. Oh boy, that goes back in my history. Both in their Houston and Washington, D.C. offices, where she chairs the firm's environmental law practice. She has extensive experience handling complex civil and criminal environmental litigation. From 1981 to 1983, Carol was the U.S. Department of Justice Assistant Attorney General in charge of the environmental and Lands Division. And then from 1984 to 85, Carol served as the Deputy Attorney General, the number 2 position in the Department of Justice. She also has served as chair of the board of the Nature Conservancy, the world's largest conservation organization. Carol has also served on the ABA Board of Governors and chaired the Board of Editors of the ABA Journal. She's the former chair of the ABA section on environmental, energy, and resources law. And she is past president of the American College of Environmental Lawyers. Needless to say, Carol is one of the most respected environmental lawyers in the country. We've asked Carol to address, the Texas City Refinery incident and the many issues that arose around that catastrophic event. Our thought is that Texas City provides an important case study, both from a legal and regulatory perspective, as well as a management and operational viewpoint. None of us want that type of incident to occur in Salt Lake City. Our hope is that by discussing events like this and learning from them, we will more effectively avoid that happening here. In addition, I know from my own experience as an environmental lawyer for a company that good companies these days take great care in managing safety and environmental issues. Understanding what can and is being done by those companies is also important. Please welcome Carol Dinkins.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank all of you for attending this session and for your warm welcome. You're to be commended for studying these issues, and they are very difficult ones. And I'm always glad to talk about what happened at Texas City, what was done about it, and the lessons that were learned. And there are, as you would expect, a great many lessons. I'll talk this morning about the background, and then the aftermath, and then, as I said, the lessons learned. This is a general overview of what we'll cover today, and the setting is at the Texas City Refinery. This is, or was, BP's largest refinery and its most complex refinery. It had a rated capacity of 460,000 barrels per day and production of about 11 million gallons of gasoline a day. It was the second largest refinery in Texas and the third largest, and still is, refinery in the United States. It produced jet fuel, diesel fuels, and chemical feedstocks with 30 process units spread over 1,200 acres. There were about 1,800 permanent BP employees at the site, and at the time of the incident, another 800 contractor workers at the site. Amoco had owned and operated the plant prior to its merger with BP in 1999. But in 2005, at the time of the incident, the refinery was still using what was essentially Amoco's safety management systems. The incident occurred in March of 2005, and on that day, a hydrocarbon vapor cloud explosion occurred in the isomerization process unit at the refinery, and we call that the Ison Unit for short. It was used to convert raffinate, which is a low octane blending feedstock, into higher octane components for unleaded gasoline. The unit had 4 sections, including a splitter, which took the raffinate and fractionated it into light and heavy components. The accident occurred when heavier than air hydrocarbons and vapors combusted after they came into contact with an ignition source. That ignition source probably was from a vehicle that was inside the refinery fence line. And that was one of the many lessons that was learned, was that you need to minimize the vehicle traffic inside the fence line. The hydrocarbons came from a liquid overflow from the blowdown stack, and the pressure relief was overfilled and overheated. Liquid was pumped into the tower for almost 3 hours without any liquid being removed or any action having been taken to achieve the lower levels that were mandated by the startup procedures in effect at the time. In fact, the liquid level in the tower was about 20 times higher at the point in time just prior to the incident than it should have been. Late in the startup process, the operators decided to try to remove liquid from the tower, and that exacerbated the incident. The vaporization of the liquid feed in the tower, low in the tower, pushed the liquid up in the tower and out of the unit. It overpressurized the relief valves, and it ultimately overwhelmed the adjacent blowdown unit. BP's internal investigation estimated that about 1,100 barrels of liquid were discharged to the blowdown unit, and it had a capacity of less than 400 barrels. Most of the liquid was released to the petroleum sewer, but because the blowdown drum vented directly to atmosphere, there was a geyser-like release of about 50 barrels of highly flammable liquid and vapor from the tower. The gasoline rained down on the ground in the refinery in less than 2 minutes, and then it ignited, and there were a series of explosions. That's a summary of what I have just told you. This is a schematic of the unit in the refinery, and what you will see with the light-colored items on the schematic are the areas that were most directly affected. They were essentially rubble down to the ground. The number of deaths and injuries was badly exacerbated by the fact that there were 2 temporary units, trailers, as we call them, because there was a lot of construction activity at the refinery, and particularly in this area. And so temporary workers were placed in these trailers. These are the trailers right here in case you cannot see them. But what you can see very clearly on this schematic is that those trailers that were just office units, nothing more than that, are surrounded by process units in the refinery. The decision to place those trailers in that location was a very poor decision. None of the people who were killed, none of the fatalities were BP employees. All of the fatalities were contract workers, and they were all people who were in those trailers. The operators were not injured. They were in buildings slightly away from the production unit, and so they did not experience the trauma that those in the trailers experienced. So this is a schematic of the unit before the incident, and there is a photograph of it to make it a little bit clearer for you. These are the compounding factors, some of which I have mentioned. The immediate consequence was the 15 fatalities, but there were nearly 200 workers injured. Some of them were very, very badly injured. Others of them, fortunately, less so. As you would expect with this kind of a disaster, the refinery operations were seriously impacted, and employee morale was very low, again, not surprisingly. The long-term consequences, of course, the most significant are the fatalities and the injuries, but it was enormously expensive for BP to deal with this tragedy. You see a summary there of the out-of-pocket costs to the company, and they are severe. The company spent about $1 billion in upgrades to the refinery, and at some points in time had as many as 1,200 or more contract workers as they rebuilt some of the units and upgraded others of the units. They did not rebuild the isomerization unit. The non-financial impacts, of course, were very severe, and perhaps even more so than one might have predicted at the point in time of the tragedy. Executives from the plant manager, who was a high-level executive in the company, all the way up through the CEO based in London, left the company over the few years following the incident. In addition, a number of the managers at lower levels, supervisors, and operators also left the company. There was a huge impact on the workforce at Texas City. And then, as you know, this sort of incident seriously tarnishes the reputation of a company like BP. And it's something that has continued to follow the company through the years. The last entry on this slide, license to operate, is not actually a license granted by a governmental regulatory entity, but rather it's the company's ability to do business as a result of its reputation, as a result of its standing in the community. And BP was very concerned about its license to continue to operate because of the impact on its reputation. This gives you an overview of the immediate crisis response, and as you might imagine, it was a very difficult time. And the initial response, of course, was the first responders who came in for the search and recovery and rescue operations. And very quickly, we realized that there were 15 fatalities. BP had its own fire department on site and, of course, its own emergency medical responders, and they were able to get people to the hospitals very quickly. But it was quite a difficult time. And I received the first call from in-house counsel at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the incident had occurred about 3 hours prior to that. And then they called me again at home about 11 o'clock at night and asked if I could be at the refinery before daybreak. It was spring break, not just in Texas, but in Chicago, and there were no seats on any planes to get in-house counsel from Chicago to Houston. And so some of the in-house BP lawyers who work in Houston were able to get to the refinery. They were not people who were assigned to refinery activities, but they got out there to help with the initial response. One of the first things that we had to do, of course, was to secure the site, because you have to make sure that the evidence is not touched and that nobody goes on site without authorization from somebody in charge, and that nothing is touched, moved, or otherwise disturbed. And so that was the immediate need. But following very closely behind that was the need to secure records and documents and tapes. And that was what the in-house counsel and I spent the first few hours of the next day accomplishing. We had to send out document hold notices and make sure that people received them, read them, and followed them, because you don't want anybody accused of having tampered with evidence or having concealed something or having destroyed evidence in a situation like this. And so that's of immediate concern. Plaintiffs' lawyers in the Galveston area immediately went into state court and got TROs for securing the site and maintaining the site. And then we engaged a consultant to make sure that the evidence was preserved. BP also immediately stood up its internal investigation team, and that team consisted of an executive from London who was not in the chain of the refinery operations. They had someone who was expert in root cause analysis. They had someone from the local union who represents the workers, and then they had several other people. The work that was done by the internal investigation team was not done under privilege, it was not confidential, and it was made public some while after they had done their investigation and as soon as they had completed their report. The longer-term issues are, unsurprisingly, a matter of dealing with the legal issues. One of the things that we did internally was organize a team of counsel, outside counsel mainly, to investigate the incident so that we could determine what was necessary to defend the company and what employees, what executives might need individual counsel, and then what posture to take in terms of dealing with the regulators and with the enforcement personnel. Because if you don't understand the facts, if you don't understand what led up to an incident, then you cannot engage in a meaningful way with government investigators. And so we spent a great deal of time on those efforts. We coordinated, well, we tried to coordinate. I shouldn't say we did coordinate, because we were dealing with OSHA, the CSB, EPA, the TCEQ. We had a lot of different governmental interests involved, as you would expect. And so it was a matter of not so much coordinating with them as it was of responding to what their requests were and their needs. The Chemical Safety Board, CSB, was on site the day after the incident, well, not the day after, thank you, but 2 days after the incident, and they immediately began to request documents and to interview people, as did OSHA. OSHA was on site the same day as the incident, and they began to interview people the next day. And we provided court reporters, and we made sure that counsel was available as requested, and we monitored these interviews as they went forward. But within the space of probably 30 hours, OSHA and the CSB had probably conducted a dozen or a dozen and a half separate interviews. And so it moved very quickly. I've mentioned a couple of the entities that were involved in the investigations. Here's a list of them, just so you can get them in mind. And the FBI came out the very first day of the incident because they have to look at something like this to make sure that there was not terrorist activity. Remember, this was in 2005, only a few years after 9/11. And they quickly concluded that it had not been terrorist activity. And then they got involved when the grand jury investigation got underway, and they supported and assisted the Department of Justice in the federal grand jury investigation. The fire marshal also was involved, not surprisingly, but we didn't have a lot of interaction with him. There was some congressional oversight, but not as much as occurred the following year after the oil spill on the North Slope that BP experienced. And then more of the Texas City incident got caught up in the oversight hearings and oversight investigations associated with the North Slope spill. This provides you with a timeline and gives you a sense of the time that it took the various entities who were conducting investigations and developing reports to conclude their work. It was a massive undertaking. There were a lot of people to interview, a lot of documents to review, but it pretty quickly became clear in the space of just a few days after starting the investigations generally what had happened and what had gone wrong. But it took a lot longer to dig deeper and deeper to be able to understand what might be done to prevent something like this from occurring again. This timeline takes you all the way down to the personal injury trials, and these were trials that occurred in state district court in Galveston County, and the refinery is located in Galveston County. And these trials were of groups of individuals, not all of the individuals at one time. And they were grouped according to the severity of the injuries and whether there was property damage and other types of ways of grouping them. This gives you a little additional information about the timeline, and it shows that the incident having occurred in March of 2005, BP was not done with probation as a result of the plea agreement until 2012, and that is also when BP was able to settle the OSHA claims, which took an enormous amount of negotiation. I mentioned the role of the CSB. Not only were they on site, they were holding press conferences several times a day, and so the local TV stations had their units set up out in the parking lot right at the front gate of the refinery. And that in and of itself has a chilling effect on the morale of the workers who have to go in and out every day past the TV cameras and have to see this explosion repeatedly on television, on the news in the evening. That cannot be underestimated, the effect of it. The CSB had quite a large number of its investigative staff on this. This was the largest incident that CSB had investigated until this time. And I think when they undertook this investigation, there were a lot of people who'd not heard of CSB, didn't know what they did, didn't know why they were there. They've since become better known, but their role is not one of any kind of regulatory activity, not any kind of enforcement activity, not litigation. Their role is to look at industrial incidents and to make recommendations on how to prevent reoccurrence. And that's what they focused on. The Baker Panel was established as a result of an urgent safety recommendation by the CSB very shortly after it had started its investigation. And BP and I accompanied them, invited former Secretary of State, former Chief of Staff at the White House, James Baker, to chair a panel to conduct the investigation of BP's refinery operations and activities from a safety point of view. This gives you a summary of what the Baker panel studied and what its conclusions were and what its recommendations were. And you see through here process safety, you see safety culture, and you see performance evaluation. These are not surprising things, but these were fundamental things to the incident in March of 2005. This gives you more detail on what the recommendations of the Baker panel were. The Baker panel was a very significant undertaking for BP, and they paid very close attention to the work that the panel was doing as it was underway, and even more attention to the outcome of that study. And they took to heart the recommendations, and they implemented those recommendations. And those have all had a very profound effect on the company and on how the company is organized and how it functions. The panel did not investigate what caused the 2005 incident. The panel investigated safety process systems, the safety culture, and such things as that at all 5 of the BP refineries that are around the United States. And so it was quite a large undertaking. The CSB looked at technical root causes. They were very interested in what the root causes of the incident were, as was the BP internal investigation team. And when you look at process safety management guidance and when you look at incident investigation guidance, you see how important root cause analysis is in that arena. And that was something of great interest to the TCEQ also. One of the most significant recommendations from the CSB related to the board of directors, and indeed BP did assign appoint a non-executive director with expertise in process safety and safety management. And that has been a very lively part of the board discussions and the board oversight since this incident. These are recommendations the CSB came forward with. And again, these are recommendations that BP implemented, and they have had a long history now since these came out of implementation of them. But you see that they're broad and they're also very specific, such as the final one on this slide, which relates to process startup procedures. One of the things that we learned in the investigation was that the operator indeed did print out the startup procedures. He printed them. They were still on the printer after the incident. He didn't read them. The checklist that was supposed to have been completed prior to startup occurring had been filled in, but the boxes had been checked exactly the same way as they had been checked on other days without regard to what was going on that day, what you might call a check-the-box mentality, so that they were not operators who were really engaged in thinking about the safety of each step of the process that they were starting up. And of course, at a refinery, those of you who've not dealt with refineries, you would want to recognize that startup and shutdown are the dangerous times, the really dangerous times in a refinery. And of course, this was a startup, but it was what they thought at the refinery was the least complex of all 30 process units. That refinery has some enormously complicated units. And this one, for a refinery, was deceptively simple and yet created such a terrible disaster. Let's look then at what EPA did. As you would expect, they immediately sent an on-scene coordinator, and BP and the OSC stood up the incident response team immediately. And BP had designated, as is customary, a command center and personnel within the refinery and from outside who were there to work with EPA in terms of immediate reaction to the event. The OSC stayed on site for some days, but it was not long before that part of the response was concluded and shut down. BP and EPA did reach a Clean Air Act consent decree after several years. This didn't really go to the incident, although it arose from EPA inspections that occurred after the incident. You remember one of my earlier slides, I said that one of the fallouts is increased regulatory attention. This is an example of that increased attention. There also was a consent decree on RMP, risk management planning, and that too rose from inspections after the incident. The Justice Department, once things had settled down and it was clear that the response had gone as far as it could, then the Justice Department undertook a grand jury investigation. And we began to get subpoenas and requests to interview potential witnesses. And so we dealt with that for several years. And then in October of 2007, reached a plea agreement with the Justice Department. And that plea agreement is under the Clean Air Act. You might ask, where is OSHA in that plea agreement? Since there were worker fatalities and severe worker injuries, why isn't OSHA a party on behalf of the United States? And why was there a felony charged under the Clean Air Act, but no felonies charged for the fatalities or the injuries? It's because of the way the OSH Act is written. It only applies to employees. It does not apply to contract workers. And you recall, I mentioned all of the fatalities were contract workers. Additionally, it provides for misdemeanors and not fatalities. And so this is one of the things that from time to time Congress does consider, but it has not been subject to very intense scrutiny from a legislative standpoint. The notice of disqualification, that's pretty well automatic under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and it means that the facility that was the subject of the incident and the criminal prosecution is suspended from being a government contractor for that particular incident. Those of you who followed the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon know that the Debarment Office at EPA has gone beyond that, and they are now looking at headquarters as facilities, not just where an incident occurred. But at this point in time, it went to this particular facility. And the probationary period lasted for 3 years, and we interacted with the probation office and with the Justice Department for the entire 3 years. Probation often for a company is a pretty straightforward matter, and certainly the probation officer dealt with us in a very straightforward way. But whenever there was any kind of an incident, such as a release to the air, when there was a process upset and a flare went off, we would get attention not just from the regulators, but from the prosecutors as well. And so once the plea agreement was executed and entered by the court, the matter was not necessarily off the radar scope. This is just a summary of the plea agreement, which I've already mentioned. And then OSHA was there immediately, but there was a lot that happened after the immediate response to the incident. BP and OSHA reached a settlement agreement. It was a rather complicated settlement agreement. It was lengthy, and it required a lot of activity by the refinery. And over time, as a result of inspections, OSHA concluded that BP had not done some of what it had agreed to do. But first, just look at what was required by the 2005 settlement. A not insubstantial monetary penalty and a great deal of requirements of various things that BP had to put into place in the refinery. And then, as I mentioned, OSHA kept coming back and inspecting, and this was a very comprehensive inspection by OSHA in 2009. And it was to monitor compliance with the 2005 settlement agreement. And as a result of that inspection, OSHA issued a number of additional allegations of violations, very tough ones to deal with. And as you see, that led to additional monetary penalties for BP and an additional settlement agreement with OSHA. But in July of 2012, it was a great relief when OSHA was able to conclude that BP had complied with its requirements. Then the TCEQ was not really terribly visible in the immediate aftermath of the incident. It was part of the response team for the government, but it was a while after that before we had a lot of interaction with the TCEQ. But in November of the same year as the incident, we negotiated a corrective action plan with TCEQ, and once that was done, we also needed the agreement on Subpart J under the Clean Air Act for operation of the flares. And this was really important because we could not construct the flares without authorization, and we could not get authorization for construction of the flares fast enough to get the flares under construction and operation. The only way to do what we needed to do and to be operating in compliance with the law was to get an agreed enforcement order with TCEQ. And so that's what the Subpart J item is about. And then TCEQ referred violations to the Office of the Attorney General in Texas. And this is a history of what the Texas Attorney General did. And we had a lot of back and forth. We thought we were making good progress to a settlement agreement with the OAG, but then the Attorney General filed suit. And that was a bit disruptive, to say the least. And so we worked very hard to reach an agreed TRO with the OAG and TCEQ of things that we would do immediately and let the case go on. So what we did in effect was negotiate the injunctive relief, and at the end of the day, this litigation really ended up being about the penalties rather than about the injunctive relief, which is the best thing for a company because it's very risky if you leave it to a judge to decide what injunctive relief you need. It's much better if you work it out so that what you're required to do and the schedule you're required to do it on is done on consent. And we were able to achieve that, which was hugely helpful. I mentioned the internal investigation. It was quite rigorous, and it took an enormous amount of time. It was a full-time job for all of the people on the internal investigation team. But they were able to get their report out by the end of 2005, at least their interim report. The final report, unlike the interim report, did go on and identify root causes. And the root causes are, as I said earlier, essential in analyzing an event like this because you need to go further and further down into the decision-making of what occurred on the day of the incident and the days leading up to it so that you know how to design your systems to prevent that happening again. These are very serious findings. These are not lightly considered. These are very significant. There were additional recommendations. As you can see, there were a lot of recommendations that grew out of the internal investigation. And one that is very significant for this event, of course, was the facility siting. But it's also the hazard analysis, the management of change, and the hazardous operations studies. All of those are of great importance in process operations like what was occurring at the Texas City Refinery. But all of those were short-circuited with this incident. And so BP had to look at all of this and figure out what kinds of response, what kinds of systems needed to be put in place. I've mentioned these already. They took a lot of time, they distracted people, but they were just part of the picture, and there's something that you have to expect. As I mentioned, there was a lot of personal injury litigation. There were people who were very seriously injured, and BP immediately flew the family members and put them up at hotels in Galveston so they could be near the hospitals. They paid or provided funding to pay for the funerals and to support the families when all of a sudden the income from their hourly worker supporters was gone as a result of this tragedy. And so they did what they could from a humanitarian standpoint, but it just was a very difficult situation. These trials usually would last about 2 weeks, and then there would be a settlement. There were claimants with varying levels of viable claims, I guess is how I would put it. And so it took a great deal of sorting out before a solution, a resolution for settlement could come into place. And that's why you see these trials having lasted 2 weeks before settlement occurred. And some trials, of course, go all the way to verdict, but in these instances, there were settlements. There was shareholder litigation, and the shareholders, of course, when the stock value goes down, oftentimes there are activists who are looking at whether there is culpability that can be the subject of litigation, and so often with something of this magnitude, they conclude there is. This is another arena where BP spent an enormous amount of time and money and had a lot of lawyers involved. And so I don't devote much attention to it in the presentation, but recognize that it is a big distraction and can be very costly. These are impacts that we talked about earlier, but I bring up the license to operate again because it was a thing that we were very mindful of and talked about a great deal in our meetings on a daily basis. And for the first 6 weeks, we would start about 6 in the morning, which is right about the time the shift change occurs at the refinery. We usually got there before that so that we could interview people coming and going without interrupting them in their operational duties. And BP brought in catered breakfast, lunch, and dinners for 6 weeks. And I don't know if any of you have been to Texas City, but it's one of the places where all the food on the plate is the same color, white. There were not, I think, a lot of caterers who were used to providing salads and broccoli. And I remember one night about 9 o'clock when we were wrapping up our daily briefing of managers, and I said, well, I'm going home now because my husband's fixing dinner. And they were very dismayed because they all had their tuna fish sandwiches. But it was a very difficult time for all of the employees at the refinery. And as I said, just walking past TV cameras every day and seeing it on TV every night, the explosion photographs over and over again was very trying. Looking then at lessons learned and thinking about the board of directors, very fundamental changes were made there. And the board takes these responsibilities very seriously. Not that it didn't before, but it became much more connected to the operational side of the business, I suspect, than it had been. And then senior management. As I said, the senior managers from the refinery manager on through the refining operational organization in London, all of those levels in the chain left the company within several years of this incident. And there was an enormous change in personnel at all levels of the company, not just the operators and the supervisors who were on the front line of the incident. What I would like for you to focus on in this slide is how often process safety appears in the slide. As you heard in my introduction from Jim, I'm an environmental lawyer. What we are dealing with here is process safety. One of my partners is an engineer, and his field is OSHA and process safety management. And that was the most significant part of what we did in the aftermath of the March explosion. And process safety was something that was not given the kind of attention that personal safety was given. The leading and lagging indicators that BP really focused on before March of '05 had to do with personal safety and recordable incidents under the OSHA system. It was not process safety. And that, I think, was the most fundamental reason that the incident occurred. Process safety didn't get the same attention as personal safety. And that's why so much of the overhaul of the systems that BP has done in the aftermath of the incident has related to process safety. These are the things that I would offer as conclusions, but let me say too that after the incident, BP rebuilt much of the process equipment at the refinery. And I had on an early slide that they spent $1 billion at that refinery. They also very significantly improved all the aspects of their process safety management program. They replaced all of the blowdown stacks at the refinery, and there had been a lot of them, with a flare system that is equipped with flare gas recovery. They implemented a relief valve risk reduction program, and that in and of itself was an immense undertaking. They put in safety instrumented systems. All of that is very costly. They expanded the HSE staff. They enlarged and they updated their written operating procedures. They went process by process and looked at all of their operating procedures to make sure that they matched what was being done and that they were as up to date as they could possibly be. Needless to say, that required that they enhance the training programs. And so the amount of training and retraining that went on at the refinery was very significant. BP did